A man sits on a stone floor somewhere in Rome, a chain running from his wrist to the soldier assigned to guard him, a soldier who does not leave, not for meals, not for sleep, not ever. There is no window worth mentioning. He does not know, on the day he picks up a pen, whether he will be released or executed. He has said as much a few pages earlier, in the very letter he's writing. A young courier named Epaphroditus recently arrived here half dead from the journey, carrying a gift of money from a small church across the sea. The kind of gift that, for a prisoner with no state provision, might be the difference between eating and not eating this week. The man reads their letter. He is moved, and then, almost cautiously, as if he doesn't want to be misunderstood, he writes back something that will end up, 2,000 years later, printed on gym walls and football jerseys and graduation cards. I can do all things through him who strengthens me, not from a stage, not after a victory, from a floor with a chain on his wrist, thanking friends for keeping him alive, which raises a question worth sitting with. What exactly was Paul saying he could do? To answer that, we need to understand exactly who is writing, from where, and why this particular gift landed so heavily on him. The year is somewhere in the early 60s AD. Paul has been under some form of Roman custody for years by this point, first in Judea, then, after appealing his case to Caesar as a Roman citizen's right allowed him to do, shipped across the Mediterranean toward Rome itself, a voyage that included a shipwreck along the way. By the time he writes this letter, most scholars place him under house arrest in the capital of the empire, chained to a rotating guard from Rome's own imperial regiment, waiting for a case to be heard by the most powerful court in the known world. He mentions this guard himself, earlier in the same letter. Word of his imprisonment, he writes, has spread through the whole imperial guard. This is not a private, forgotten cell. It's custody, at the center of Roman power, with everything that implies about how carefully a man in his position would have to watch every word he put in writing. A minority of scholars have argued for an earlier imprisonment, in Ephesus, but the majority view remains Rome, and it's the setting most consistent with the details Paul gives throughout the letter. Roman imprisonment in this period does not work the way modern viewers might picture it. There is no state cafeteria, no guaranteed provision of food or clothing. A prisoner awaiting trial survives largely on whatever friends, family, or supporters bring him, which means, practically speaking, Paul's continued survival in these years depends heavily on people willing to travel, to spend money, to take real personal risk on behalf of a man in Roman custody for a controversial new religious movement. This is where a small church far to the north becomes essential to the story. Years earlier, Paul had first come to the city of Philippi, a Roman colony in the province of Macedonia. Philippi wasn't an ordinary provincial town. Originally founded by Philip II of Macedon, it had later been resettled with Roman veterans following the famous battle fought there between Octavian and the assassins of Julius Caesar. And as a Roman colony, it modeled its architecture, its laws, and its civic pride on Rome itself, a level of Roman identity unusual for a city so far from the capital. Citizens of Philippi often carried Roman citizenship and thought of themselves, culturally, almost as transplanted Romans living on foreign soil. That detail matters more than it might first appear, because it means the church Paul is writing to would have been steeped in distinctly Roman values: status, self-sufficiency, civic honor, the very same values his famous sentence quietly pushes back against. It was here, in this proudly Roman city, that Paul and his companion Silas were first stripped, beaten with rods, and thrown into the innermost cell of the local prison. The very first hours of what would become one of Paul's closest, most affectionate relationships with any church he planted. The friendship between Paul and the Philippian believers begins, quite literally, inside a jail. Years pass. That congregation grows, remains devoted to Paul, and now, hearing that their friend is once again a prisoner, this time in Rome itself, awaiting an uncertain verdict, they do something costly. They send one of their own, a man named Epaphroditus, on a long, difficult journey carrying material support for Paul. It is, by any practical measure, an act of real sacrifice, money that could have stayed within their own struggling congregation, sent instead across hundreds of miles to a man in chains they may never see again. Epaphroditus nearly pays for the journey with his life, falling seriously ill somewhere along the way or after his arrival, a detail Paul mentions elsewhere in this same letter with visible relief that his friend survived. Paul calls him, tenderly, my brother and fellow worker and fellow soldier, and admits plainly that if Epaphroditus had died, Paul himself would have carried sorrow upon sorrow. This isn't an abstract exchange of funds between institutions. It's two people who love each other, one of them risking his life to reach the other. So this is the scene as Paul sits down to respond. Not a free man reflecting on ambition, not a teacher offering general encouragement from a place of comfort. A prisoner, in chains, in the capital of the empire that is deciding whether he lives or dies, holding a gift that likely kept him fed, sent by a church whose friendship with him began the same way his current situation looks, inside a prison cell. It's worth remembering, too, that this was far from the first time Paul had lived through hardship of this kind. In one of his earlier letters, defending his credibility to a skeptical church in Corinth, he lists off what his ministry has actually cost him: beatings, shipwrecks, hunger, cold, sleepless nights, danger from rivers and robbers, and his own countrymen. Whatever brought low means in Philippians 4, it isn't a figure of speech Paul reaches for casually. It's a category he has lived inside more than once, in more than one city, for more than one reason. And it's into this exact moment, thanking these exact people, carrying this exact weight of memory, that Paul writes the sentence the world would later print on jerseys and gym walls. To understand what he actually meant by it, we have to read the words he wrote just before it, because he doesn't start with, I can do all things. He starts somewhere much quieter. Paul has just received the Philippians gift, and before he says anything about strength or ability, he does something almost awkward. He explains himself. I rejoiced in the Lord greatly, that now at length you have revived your concern for me. Not that I am speaking of being in need, for I have learned, in whatever situation I am, to be content. Notice how careful this opening is. Paul doesn't simply say thank you. He seems almost worried about being misread, quick to clarify that his joy over their gift isn't because he was desperate, isn't a cry for help dressed up as gratitude. And then comes the phrase most readers skip straight past on their way to the famous verse 2 sentences later. I have learned to be content. Sit with that word learned for a moment. This is a man in his 60s, by most estimates, a former Pharisee, a church planter, someone who has spent years traveling the ancient world under increasingly difficult conditions. And he doesn't say contentment came naturally to him. He says he learned it, meaning there was a version of Paul who hadn't learned it yet. Somewhere back there is an earlier Paul, less settled, less steady, who had to be shaped into the man capable of writing this letter. This one word quietly undercuts a lot of what people assume about the verse that follows. If contentment were simply a fact about Paul's personality, I can do all things, might sound like an inborn gift. But Paul frames it as something acquired, the outcome of a process, not a default setting. Which raises an obvious question. Learned how? Through what, exactly? Paul answers that question immediately, and in doing so, gives us the actual content of what he's calling the secret he's learned. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. Here's the detail worth slowing all the way down for. Paul doesn't list only hardship. He lists two opposite conditions, being brought low and abounding, hunger and plenty, need and abundance, and treats both as equally part of what he had to learn to face. It would be easy to assume that a man writing from prison, thanking people for a survival gift, is only talking about how to endure lack. But that's not what the text actually says. Paul pairs poverty with prosperity as if they are two sides of the same test, not one hard season and one easy one. He is saying, in effect, I have had to learn to be steady with nothing, and I have also had to learn to be steady with enough, and neither one, on its own, was automatic. Think of it like two very different kinds of terrain that both require the same kind of balance to cross safely, a narrow bridge and a wide open field. It's tempting to think the bridge is the only place you could fall, but an open field with nothing to hold on to and no reason to be careful can throw a person off balance just as easily, in a different way. This matters enormously for what comes next, because it means Paul isn't building toward a verse about surviving one specific kind of hardship. He's building toward a verse about the full range of a life he no longer needs to control, the empty seasons and the full ones both included. Old Testament wisdom writers had wrestled with a similar tension centuries earlier. One proverb asks God for neither poverty nor riches, reasoning that too much might tempt a person to forget God, while too little might tempt a person to steal. Paul isn't quoting that text directly, but he's standing in a long tradition that had already recognized abundance and scarcity as twin spiritual dangers, not just one obvious hardship and one comfortable exception. Which brings us to the exact sentence the world has quoted for centuries, and the moment where its actual context either gets carried forward or gets left behind. Now the famous line arrives, "I can do all things through him who strengthens me." Here is the detail almost no one notices, because almost no one reads this sentence attached to what precedes it. There are two words hovering silently over all things that never get printed on the jersey or the poster. The words, those things. All those things, the plenty and the hunger, the abundance and the need, the being brought low and the being lifted up. That is the all things Paul has just spent 2 verses defining, in careful, deliberate detail, immediately before he says he can do it. Grammatically, all things is broad. The Greek word simply means everything, but context narrows meaning constantly in language, and Paul has just told us, in the clearest possible terms, what everything refers to in this sentence. Not exams, not competitions, not a general promise of accomplishing any goal a person sets. The specific range of circumstances he has just named, scarcity and abundance, want and plenty. This is not a claim about limitless achievement. It's a claim about limitless steadiness, that whatever end of the spectrum life hands him, empty-handed or overflowing, he has found a strength that holds regardless. Not a promise that Christ will hand him victories, a confession that Christ has kept him from being controlled by either extreme. And that distinction changes everything about how this verse should be read next to a locker room banner or a graduation photo, which is exactly the tension the video now has to sit with directly. If you just reread that verse and noticed, for the first time, the words quietly hovering over all things, those things, the plenty and the hunger Paul had already named, you caught something most people never do, even after hearing this verse quoted 100 times. That's worth sitting with. If this kind of close reading is what you come here for, the details sitting in plain sight, waiting for someone to actually slow down and look, that's exactly what this channel exists to do. Subscribing means you won't miss where this thread goes next, because there's still a piece of this we haven't touched. Paul says he learned the secret of facing both plenty and hunger, and that word secret isn't ordinary vocabulary. It's borrowed from a very specific corner of the ancient world, a world Paul's original readers in Philippi would have recognized instantly. And once you see where that word comes from, it becomes clear Paul isn't just describing his own experience. He's quietly rewriting a conversation his entire audience already knew by heart. Start with the word itself, because it's stranger than it looks in English. When Paul writes, "I have learned the secret," the Greek verb behind secret is memyamai, a word with a very specific pedigree in the ancient Mediterranean world. It comes from the same root that gives us the English word mystery, and in Paul's day, it was closely associated with the language of initiation, being led into the knowledge of a mystery religion, one of the various Greco-Roman cults that admitted members gradually, through stages, into secret rites and hidden teaching not available to outsiders. To be initiated was to have crossed a threshold others hadn't crossed, to now possess something that couldn't simply be handed to you all at once. It had to be entered into, step by step. That's the word Paul reaches for. which is a strange choice, on the surface, for a former Pharisee writing to a young church about contentment. Paul isn't a stranger to Greco-Roman culture. He grew up in Tarsus, a city soaked in Hellenistic learning, and he clearly knows how to use language his audience will recognize. But this particular word carries baggage. It doesn't just mean, "I figured something out." It carries the flavor of being brought into something exclusive, something with layers, something you don't simply know but are gradually let in on. Now place that word next to the other term already sitting in this same passage, autarkeis, translated content, in verse 11. I have learned, in whatever situation I am, to be content. This word has its own well-documented history in the ancient world, and it isn't a neutral, everyday term either. It was practically a technical term in Stoic philosophy, one of the most influential schools of thought in the Greco-Roman Mediterranean. Stoic teachers used autarkes to describe the ideal wise person, someone who had trained themselves, through reason and discipline, to be entirely self-sufficient, undisturbed by external circumstance, needing nothing outside their own inner resources to remain steady. A Stoic philosopher achieving autarkeis was considered to have mastered himself completely, a goal pursued through years of philosophical training, discipline of the will, and detachment from anything outside one's own control. Now hold both of these words together, and something becomes visible that's easy to miss reading either one alone. Paul, writing to a congregation in a proudly Roman colony, a city where educated citizens would have been exposed to exactly this kind of Greco-Roman philosophical vocabulary, reaches for the same word, Stoic philosophy, used for its highest ideal of inner self-mastery. And then, in the very next verse, he explains how he arrived at it using language borrowed from religious initiation. This is worth sitting with, because it means Paul appears to be doing something quite deliberate with language, not simply describing his personal experience in whatever words came to mind. He takes a term the philosophical world already prized, the self-sufficient wise man, untouched by circumstance, and applies it to himself. And then, almost immediately, he explains that this self-sufficiency didn't come from within him, the way a Stoic would claim. It came from being initiated into something, but not a mystery religion, and not his own inner discipline. He names the source explicitly in the very next breath. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Many scholars read this as more than coincidence, though it should be held with appropriate care, since we cannot know with certainty how consciously Paul intended every echo. But the pattern is difficult to dismiss entirely. Paul appears to be borrowing the vocabulary of a philosophical ideal his Roman colony audience would have recognized instantly, and quietly relocating its source. The Stoic says, I have trained myself to need nothing. Paul says, I have been given a strength I did not manufacture. This reframes the entire famous verse in a direction almost the opposite of how it gets used today. In its popular modern form, I can do all things through Christ, often functions as a kind of spiritual willpower verse, as if Christ simply supercharges human ambition, the way a Stoic might supercharge his own self-discipline. But Paul's actual language is doing something quieter, and, in a real sense, more humbling. He isn't claiming to have out-disciplined the Stoics at their own game. He's claiming that the self-sufficiency they spent their whole philosophy chasing from within themselves, he received from outside himself, through Christ. Not self-made steadiness, given steadiness, which brings the whole passage back to where the verse spine has been pointing from the beginning. All things, as we've already seen, is bounded by hunger and plenty, want and abundance, not achievement or victory. And now the word secret adds one more layer to that same picture. The contentment Paul describes was never the product of his own inner strength perfected over time, the way the philosophical world around him might have framed it. It was something he was led into, gradually, by a strength outside himself, that met him equally in empty seasons and full ones. Not a man who finally became strong enough to need nothing, a man who learned, slowly, that he had never needed to be. Pull back far enough, and it stops looking like a slogan. It starts looking like a scene. A man on a stone floor, a chain on his wrist, a guard who never leaves. he doesn't know if he'll live. A courier arrives, half dead from the journey, carrying a gift that might be the only thing standing between Paul and going hungry this week. And Paul, before he says a single word about strength, stops to explain himself. Not because he's ungrateful, because he doesn't want to be misread. I have learned, not always known, not naturally gifted with peace. Learned, the way a person learns anything hard, slowly, the long way, through the actual years it takes. He names what he learned facing. Not one kind of hard. 2. Hunger and plenty. Empty hands and full ones. A bridge with nothing to hold and a field with nothing to catch him. Both, he says, could throw a person off balance. Both had to be learned. And then the sentence the world would later frame and print and stitch onto jerseys. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Not all things floating free. All things exactly as he'd just defined them, 2 verses earlier, in the same breath. The hunger, the plenty, the being brought low, the being lifted up. Nothing about exams, nothing about victories, nothing about a battle won on a field, or a deal closed in a boardroom. A Roman colony, full of citizens who knew exactly what it meant to master yourself from the inside, the stoic way, the disciplined way, the self-made way. And Paul reaches for their own word for it, self-sufficient, unshaken, complete, and hands it back, changed. Not self-made, given, not something he achieved, something he was led into, like a man walked slowly through a door he didn't build himself, a prisoner, a gift, a word borrowed from philosophers and quietly rewritten, a word borrowed from mystery religions and quietly redirected, 2 extremes, held together by the same steady hand. Not a promise that Christ helps you win, a confession that Christ had kept one particular man from being owned, not by what he lacked and not by what he had. That's the sentence. That's the floor it was written on. There's a version of this verse most of us have prayed at some point, even if we never said it in these exact words. Give me the strength to pull this off. The interview, the diagnosis, the exam, the audition, the thing we're not sure we can survive, let alone succeed at. And when it doesn't happen, when the job doesn't come through, when the treatment doesn't work, when the thing we needed strength for simply doesn't go our way, there's a quiet, specific ache that follows. Not just disappointment, something closer to confusion. I claimed the verse. Why didn't it hold? That confusion makes sense if the verse was ever promising what it sounds like it's promising. But it was never promising an outcome. Paul doesn't say Christ gave him victory over his imprisonment. He was still in chains when he wrote it. He doesn't say Christ got him released, or vindicated, or proven right. As far as the text tells us, none of that had happened yet, and he had no guarantee it ever would. What he says is something much smaller and much harder to advertise, that whatever the outcome turned out to be, empty-handed or full, he had found a strength that didn't depend on which one he got. That's a different kind of promise than most of us go looking for. It doesn't say the outcome will go your way. It says something can hold steady inside you, either way it goes. There's something worth sitting with in that, quietly, without rushing past it. Most of us are far more prepared for one half of Paul's list than the other. We brace for hunger. We build entire support systems, prayers, friendships, coping strategies for the seasons of lack, the diagnosis, the layoff, the loss. But Paul names abundance as its own kind of danger, its own thing that has to be learned, not just endured. Plenty can quietly convince a person they don't need anything outside themselves anymore. Success can feel like proof that the strength was ours all along. It's a strange thing to realize that the emptier seasons of a life may sometimes leave more room for grace to be visible than the full ones do. None of this makes the ache of an unanswered prayer disappear. Paul isn't offering a trick that removes hunger or dissolves hardship. He's offering something quieter than removal, an account of a man who had genuinely known both extremes, who wasn't speaking from a comfortable distance, and who says, without triumph or performance, that he found something steady inside both of them. Not because he was strong enough on his own to withstand either, because something outside him held when he had nothing left to hold with, and when he had more than enough and could have quietly stopped depending on anything at all. Maybe that's the part of this ancient letter that reaches furthest into an ordinary life. Not a guarantee that the outcome will be what we're hoping for, just the possibility, tested by a man who had far less certainty about his own future than most of us will ever have, that the strength he was given wasn't tied to how the story turned out. It was tied to who was holding him while the story was still being written. Paul never said he could do anything. He said he could survive everything, and that was never his own doing. If this changed the way you'll read that verse next time you see it, on a wall, a jersey, a card, that's why this channel exists. Subscribe to the Scripture Project so studies like this keep finding you. Share it with someone who's been quietly asking why the verse didn't work the way they expected. And if a line here stayed with you, leave it in the comments. This is a community built on one honest conversation at a time.